I'm one of a group who's been planning these historical events for this year. Honestly, I think it must be about 2 years now we've really been moving. I think Jonathan, at least over a year, we've been talking with you, Jonathan, well over a year. So it's been quite a bit of work. Don Campbell, one of our group, who right here, raise your hand, Don. He is the one who, among many other things, developed the idea of acknowledging a place, a house, which stood here in Northfield and at 88 Main Street. It is no longer here, but the location is. Squawky Village is there now. And I want to mention that Janice Newton, who's with us today and lives in Squawky Village, has mapped out the lot now. And what's the interesting things that she points out, there are two things that are still there from the past. There's a fireplace that might be in the photos that Jonathan's going to show us, a wonderful big stone fireplace. And there's also an oak tree which is called the Peace Tree, which I think was probably put there later than when the Smiths lived here. But those are two things that are still there that you might want to look at. The fireplace is probably going to be revamped, and I hope if they do it, they'll leave the little secret hidey hole that Jonathan talks about where people hid their keys. So thank you very much, Janice, for bringing these here, and I have a few copies of this. So I was saying that Dawn has helped to do so many things. One of the things we have back here is a photo board of the biography of a house concept, because his idea was to have 3 different events that highlight the things that happened in this house at 88 Main Street, this wonderful old house. So you can see different times of the house on that photo board. So this is 3 chapters of that house's life. This is chapter 2 today. We already had a Timothy Swan concert. He was a sacred music and popular music writer back in the 1700s, and he lived in that house too. And we've had a program about him. Today, our stories are of the American Youth Hostel, which was started here in Northfield in 1934, and for most of its time was at 88 Main Street. Isabel and Monroe Smith started this movement here in the United States, and their son, Jonathan Smith, who's with us today, is our very special guest. You'll hear from Jonathan a bit later. We also will hear from Joel Fowler. Those of you from Northfield and the surroundings know Joel. He's a Northfield historian, and he's well known and well loved. And also someone that we've just met moments ago, Danielle Brumfitt Norris, who's here representing International Hosteling USA. And she's traveled quite a distance to be here, and we'll hear a little bit about what hosteling is now in this country and in this world. The other part of this day is music. We're going to begin with music, a few songs, maybe 2 or 3, and we're going to end with songs. Songs that you might sing around a fireplace or a campfire. Some of these songs come right out of the American Youth Hostel Songbook. We're going to begin with music. Annie Patterson and Peter Blood, the creators of Rise Up Singing, will start us off with some music.
Hey, Mary.
Peter. Yes.
Mary, one thing.
What?
Why biography of a house? Each house people live in stories.
Say it, Don. Say it loudly. Say it.
Yeah, so the idea of the biography of a house is to remind people also that whatever house they live in, or maybe lived in, has stories as well. So this is sort of a go-get-it thing about, think about what happened in your house, right from the beginning and including your own lives, because this is, this may be larger than life stories, but they're in every house. So enjoy that.
And actually, before you sing, hold on one second, I would like to ask Amy Sinclair to come up here and just say 2 or 3 sentences about who she is and why she's interested in being here today. Thanks, Amy.
Hi, I'm Amy St. Clair. My family bought the youth hostel from John Z.'s parents, Isabel and Monroe, and we operated the youth hostel there, and we children grew up in that house, and so it's got many fond memories for me, and Northfield has many fond memories for me. It's my childhood home. Oh, and I'm supposed to say my mother was Beth Atwood.
Yes. Yeah, she wrote it. Thank you so much, Amy. Amy and Peter. All right.
Welcome, everybody. Hang on, I'm going to turn this on. Welcome, everybody. This is a chance to sing with us on songs that you recognize. I mean, if you don't, just join in when you figure it out. This is my husband, Peter. Peter and I have visited many, many youth hostels over the years. We've been married 40 years, and we've traveled all over the world. So this was a real treat to come here today and to celebrate this wonderful history. Peter and I, when we met, we created a songbook, and then in 1988, we put it out with the help of Pete Seeger. Now, some people are familiar with him. He was an iconic folk musician. Rise Up Singing has 1,200 songs in it, along with guitar chords. And we created it so you could have a resource and sing with each other around a campfire, or at a youth hostel, or anywhere, really. So we love doing this work. We love singing with people, and it's an honor to be here. Here's a song. We have not sung this in a really long time, but it is one of our favorites, so we're going to do it because it was in the Youth Hostel songbook that we got a glimpse of. We're going to sing Erie Canal, and hope you guys will join in. Well, I got a new line, her name is Sal, 15 miles on the Erie Canal. She's a good old worker and a good old pal, 15 miles on the Erie Canal. We bought some barges in our day, filled with lumber, hope, and hay, and we know every inch of the way, from Albany down to Buffalo.
one more before we turn this over to all these wonderful speakers. We actually, after the first book was out for about 30 years, people wanted to have more than 1,200 songs. So we put out a book about 5 years ago called Rise Again. And this song, I have no idea why it was left out of the first one. It's an old popular song called The Glory of Love.
If anybody's not familiar with this song, I'm sure you'll recognize it. The thing about it is, I guess Peter and I are doing this song because it's kind of like our theme song for traveling together. We just finished a month in Japan, and we did stay in a youth hostel there, and it was a fabulous experience. But one of the things we know is you got to give a little, and you got to take a little, and that's the story of, and that's the glory of love. So sing with us. You got to give a little, take a little, let your heart break a little. That's the story of, that's the glory of love. Oh, you guys know the story. You got to laugh a little, cry a little, let the clouds roll by a little. That's the story of, that's the glory of love. Well, as long as there's the two of us, we got the world and all its charms. And when the world is through with us, we got each other's arms. You got to win a little, lose a little, always have to lose a little. That's the story of, that's the glory of love. All right, so we're gonna let Peter play background. Think about those times you were traveling, and you know you might have gotten in a little fight because somebody missed the exit. And it wasn't me, but it was. But then, you know, you finally get there, and you realize it was really worth it. Here's the bridge again. Well, as long as there's the two of us, we got the world and all its charms. And when the world is through with us, we got each other's arms. You have to win a little, lose a little, always have to lose a little. That's the story of, that's the glory of, that's the story of, that's the glory. One more time. That's the story of, that's the glory of love.
Somebody's on, it's not us.
Okay, the next. Thank you so much. That was so super. We'll have a couple of songs at the end too. The next person we're going to hear is Joel Fowler, local historian, who's going to give us some background on. Actually, I don't know exactly what he's going to talk about. It's background on the youth hostel in Northfield. From his standpoint, from history's standpoint, it might be kind of the same, but it won't have pictures like Jonathan is going to. Joel, thank you.
Microphone. Thank you, Mary, and thank you for asking me to do this because I learned a bit more than I knew before, more than I can possibly share with you today. And so, even though there might be some corrections required, here is an abbreviated version. So the first question is, what is a hostel, and how did the hostel movement begin? Richard Sherman a German school teacher, first had the idea in 1909 after taking his young students for a hike through the neighboring hills and getting rained on. So the idea for him was to get the kids in and out of the great outdoors, to teach them to fend for themselves, to engage with their fellow humans in a friendly atmosphere. The problem was that there were not suitable or affordable accommodations in which to stay overnight. I did see someone mention that they thought his whole philosophy was a kind of a reaction to the Industrial Revolution. So the first, the first hostel that he managed to put together was in a partly restored 11th century castle in Altena, I believe is how you say it, in Germany in 1912. So that was 3 years later. The original rooms in that castle are still on display as a kind of museum, and there are new rooms that are still used for a hostel today. The German word, pardoning my German, for youth hostel is Jugendherberge, or youth house. The movement to build the hostels spread through Europe, especially Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. The first, the first international meeting of hosteling organizations was held in Amsterdam in 1932, when the International Youth Hostel Federation was formed and common standards were developed. The age group at that time was beginning at age 12, which changed over time to be 18. So, back in the United States, enter Monroe Smith and his wife Isabel Batchelor Smith. Monroe's parents were farmers from Vermont and moved around for work over the years. They were in Sunderland, nearby Sunderland, Mass, around 1900 when Monroe was born. In 1910 to 1913, this is sort of a chronic situation here. 1910 to 1913, they lived on Warwick Road in Northfield, where Monroe's father worked at the Northfield Seminary. Yes, somewhere like that. Yes. So when Monroe was 16, he later said he was crazy to go to the Rocky Mountains. And so he told his mother he was going to do that, and off he went, getting there by freight trains, doubtless causing his mother a bit of worry. And then 2 years later, at age 18, he was teaching at a district school in Peru, Massachusetts, in the Berkshires, while at the same time going to Mount Hermon. And I'm not sure how he did both at the same time, but he apparently did. He graduated from Mount Hermon in 1919, where he gave an oration on class day, on graduation. So from there, he went to Wesleyan in Middletown, Connecticut, and was captain of the cross-country team. He was also on the track team. He was in football, boxing, wrestling, and he was also an honor student, winning the annual Declamation Prize at Wesleyan his last 3 years, each of his last 3 years, graduating in 1924. Then he went to teach English and coach cross-country and swimming at Peekskill Academy in New York, where his first wife Hilda died in 1926. He was a camp counselor at Camp Waganaki in East Waterford, Maine, during the summer of 1927, and had joined Ernest Thompson Seton's Woodcraft Indians, or as it became known as the Woodcraft League, which is a very interesting thing that could be another program. But that was an early environmentalist group and was the forerunner to the Boy Scouts. That fall, Smith went to head the English department at Montclair Academy in New Jersey. And then he was there for a couple of years. And in June 1929, he was in Talcottville, Connecticut, or rather Isabel was in Talcottville, Connecticut, where she was from, and she was teaching art at the high school in Hartford, Connecticut. Monroe was an assistant executive of the Boy Scouts of Westchester County and was living in New Rochelle, New York, when they married. Right after which they went to the Boy Scout camp in Wingdale, New York for the summer. And then in that fall, they moved to Rochester, New York, where he was also an assistant executive, and where Isabel was, she had been teaching art, and she was also an illustrator at this time in publishing. Now, a few things that need corroborating, for me anyway, are one of them is this, that I believe they were recipients of a Carl Schurz Fellowship from the Overlander Trust that paid for their travel to Germany in July 1933. And one report said that he was going to learn about, or they were going to learn about youth hostels and to study for a PhD at the University of Berlin. I don't know that he ever did that. He did lead a tour of young people, age 12 to 18, mostly from Rochester, with support, I also understand, from Columbia University's research department, where I believe he had a master's degree in education. It may have been the political situation in Germany at that time, or it may have been the enjoyment, the great enjoyment of the hosteling trip that I think may have prevented him from staying and working on his PhD. In any event, they brought the kids back and went back to Europe in that October for the second International Hosteling Conference in Godesberg. I'll try that. Where, if they hadn't already met Richard Sherman, they did then. And the outcome of that conference was that the people at the conference themselves delegated the Smiths to go back to America and bring the hosteling idea and to start an organization. The Smiths did come back to Rochester. I found that they were speaking at a New York State youth conference at a Presbyterian church, I believe, in February 1934, and spoke about German youth facing the world. At this time, if you know any of your European history, which I don't know a lot, but Hitler's story had certainly begun, and so they were dealing with that. When Monroe Smith spoke at his brother-in-law's Congregational Church in Holyoke in March of 1934, he said that Hitler got his racist ideas from U.S. immigration law and blamed the Treaty of Versailles for the German situation. At least that's how it was reported. They were by that time, or about that time, they were in Talcottville in Connecticut when they incorporated the American Youth Hostel Association on the 16th of March, 1934. They had to do a lot of speaking to raise consciousness, to get support. They were at their Isabel's Brothers Church again in Holyoke when they talked specifically about the youth hostel movement, and evidently Bavarian costume, guitar music, and folk dances were part of the program. The Smiths sailed for Europe again with about 30 high school students in 1934 at the end of June, and did not come back until the beginning of September. And at that time, they were determined to start a hostel in this country. And it was principally, my understanding, it was principally on their own dime. They hadn't been able to raise a lot of money. They had gotten endorsements, but they hadn't gotten a lot of money yet. So they did decide on and secure the chateau in Northfield. Shell's Castle is sometimes called, in October. And so while still traveling all the time, I presume they were, quote unquote, reconstructing the basement of the chateau for the next couple of months. And why did they choose that is a question. How did they happen to choose the chateau in Northfield? I think part of it was that it was the first youth hostel in Germany was in a castle. And where else is there a castle in this country? But Northfield, and Monroe knew that because he lived here for 3 or 4 years anyway, and went to Mount Hermon. The other reasons were that it's a strategic location between the Berkshires, the Green Mountains, and the White Mountains. And the idea is that you go from hostel to hostel, and that would be a good place to do it, and probably reminiscent of all the mountains that they traversed in Europe. So they rented the chateau. I am not entirely sure of the ownership at that time, if it had yet been transferred from the Mrs. Shell to the Northfield Hotel. But in any event, they were able to rent that for 6 months for $30 a month. So they did have a grand opening. People were flocking to come, even though it was in the middle of winter. And they opened on the 27th of December, 1934, so people could come, kids could come during their school vacations. But they kept coming, even after that, throughout the winter. Some of them had traveled with the Smiths to Europe, and some of the kids came as far away as Missouri and Michigan. So you can imagine what it looked like. Ski pants were everywhere. They had speakers come from Connecticut and New York. They had well-wishers from all over Europe. The secretary of the International Rotary, also from President McConaughey of Wesleyan. I mention him because he's very connected. He was also a student at Mount Hermon, probably with Smith, and his father was one of the first members of the student youth movement, which started at Mount Hermon in 1886. So in the chateau, they divided up the basement, one for, into the boys and the girls' rooms, and they had about 25 cots in each room, complete with a mattress and 2 heavy blankets. The walls were bare brick, the floors were concrete. There were plenty of windows to open, and there was 1 stove that was allowed to go out. So there's the beginning of the youth hostels in America. We have 1 now in 1934, the end of 1934, and 2,600 in Germany alone. So how did we build it up? Mount Holyoke College stepped up, and they were the next. They had the second youth hostel, and they also wrote a petition to have that loop of hostels that would run to Mount Washington and back through the Green Mountains and the White Mountains. The Smiths went to Washington, D.C., and spoke to many people, the heads of the state and national parks. They got endorsements from Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt. They drew up guidelines for the youth hostels, and each hostel was to have a sponsoring committee as well as a house mother and a father. No smoking, no drinking. They were to be non-sectarian. You rose at 6 a.m. and you went to bed at 10 o'clock. You cooked your own meals and you respected others. And so the movement grew. They named the first hostel the Richard Sherman International Youth Hostel, after the founder in Germany. When the lease ran out, the Smiths purchased 88 Main Street. It had become available from the son and granddaughter of Lydia Vaudier Jocelyn Lindsley, who had purchased the Timothy Swan House in 1885, and whose second husband, Lindsley, was pretty well known, not in Northfield, but around the country as a hotelier. He ran hotels all over the country. So when he bought the house, he totally modernized it and transformed the house. Herbert Parsons, one of our historians, says, beyond recognition. So what it looked like before, I don't know, but it was probably at that time, it was over 100 years old. And it was also in 1890, it was the first and only house in Northfield with plate glass windows. That was interesting to me because the daughter of Lydia, Vaudier with Jocelyn Lindsley, had married the famous Ira D. Sankey, Ira D. Sankey's son, but she had died and her share went to her daughter, Grace Victoria Sankey Packard Keel. Mr. Keel being the father of Betty Nelson, for those who might recall Betty in Northfield. So at 88 Main Street, the hostel was run for over 20 years. The barn in the back of the house was renovated to serve as a residence for the travelers. And within a year, there were 35 hostels that you could go from hostel to hostel. They were mostly in New England. And then in 1937, the Smiths purchased the building across the road, which had been, is that it? That's it. It had been a hotel, the Mountain View Hotel, amongst a number of other names. So that was to be the headquarters. And I am not entirely sure what else it was. I know that they ran training classes for the youth hostel workers in that building. I don't know if kids stayed in that building, or staff. I found staff living in other locations, so I'm not sure. But there was quite an operation there in that building. And some of the other hostels that began popping up, one of them was at 55 Falls Road in Sunderland, Mass., which was where Monroe Smith was born. That's very interesting to me. I think it might be still standing. And that one actually ran longer. It ran from 37 to 1978. Other nearby hostels that you could go to were in East Coleraine, Conway, Winchester, New Hampshire, and Brattleboro. And those were the closest ones that I could find. And a couple of years later, in 1939, there were well over 200 youth hostels in the United States. And the Smiths were the directors of the association. And they were compelled to travel a bit because of that. So we needed new house parents. And one of them that I found in the late 30s was Mr. and Mrs. Robert Dumbrick. She was an Edson from Bears Plain Road. And there were others, but I don't have time for all of them. But among the employees of the larger association was Fritz Kaufhold.
Yes.
And he was born in Altena, Germany, where the hostel started, and was involved with them. But he was a war resister, and he left in 1937 to come to Northfield and worked in Northfield for the duration with the Smiths. He was friends with Robert Darwart, whose wife was also employed at the, I'm going to say AYH now, for American Youth Hostel for several years. And so Wirt and Kaufhold became friends, and they started Country Prints in Northfield, and they printed linens and tiles and everything that had a kind of a Pennsylvania Dutch aesthetic. And then they moved to Gill in 1949. And then Mrs. Kaufhold, some of us might remember, was a third grade teacher right over there. The Smiths had the vision, the passion, the dedication, and did the work, but the one element they perhaps lacked was a strong financial management and development officer. This was said to be the reason that Roosevelt withdrew his name as honorary president. It was also one of the reasons that the now Chief Executive Officer, John D. Rockefeller III, also decided to replace Monroe Smith as executive director. Rockefeller was chair of the executive committee, and encouraged Smith to resign, and all this in 1949, and to move the headquarters to New York City. In the meantime, Smith had continued the international trips, and I think they were one of the most important parts of hosteling for him, was to take kids to Europe, or to go on international trips. He also went to the Holy Land and a number of other places. So in 48, he started a separate department of the youth hostel to, I think, finance these trips for people that couldn't afford to go. and that was called the Youth Argosy, Inc. And so they took over the ownership, Youth Argosy, when the youth hostel moved to, the offices moved to New York. They had also bought a cottage on West Lane on Rustic Ridge to house visitors or staff could stay on Rustic Ridge. They bought that in the 40s, and that was also transferred to a Youth Argosy. They also, the AYH, also during the 40s, sponsored something called Camp Rabbit Hollow in Winchester, New Hampshire. And that was for poor black children from the cities. And it may still be there. Does anyone know? There's a Rabbit Hollow Road in Winchester. But I'd like to kind of wrap up, but I want to tell a couple of little stories. One was shared with me recently about a young boy named Richard who, with his older brother Carl, went on one of these hosteling trips to Europe in 1937. And afterwards, he came to Northfield to hostel, but also there were reunions of earlier hostelers. They would come to Northfield, and often in December. So one of the times, or two of the times, I guess, that he came up to Northfield from North Tarrytown, New York. He met a young lady from Philadelphia and also Northfield. And today, the family still comes to Northfield every summer. And I think one of the family might be here today. So by 1951, the Smiths decided to close out the Youth Argosy and Northfield. They were going to maybe keep an office in the big building across the street, and they were moving the operation to Florida. So they sold off West Lane in 51. They sold 88 Main Street to Robert and Beth St. Clair in 1952, and then the headquarters, there were plans to give it to an agency that ran the Rabbit Hollow camp, I think, in New York, but that didn't pan out, and so they gave it back to the bank in 1953. The St. Clairs ran 88 Main Street as a youth hostel to 1956 or 57. I haven't been able to nail down the date when it stopped. I think it became a lot of work, and on top of raising six children. And then Beth would later convey the property to the Renaissance community, which is another program. So the American Youth Hostel Association has continued to this day, now as Hosteling International USA, I believe. I think there are about 30 youth hostels.
Just under that.
Just under that, and 4 in Massachusetts, I think.
Yes.
4 in Massachusetts. Hosteling went through a revival, as you might imagine, in the 60s and 70s with the baby boomers, and I can attest to the attributes of one of those in Copenhagen in January of 73. And I believe it was the 80s and 90s that there was a hostel stop at Daly House in Northfield on Highland Avenue. One of the NMH instructors, I believe, ran that. I'm not for sure of the dates and so forth. And then lastly, I wanted to say that Monroe had 3 children who he enlisted in his work at one time or another. His daughter Betty, by his first marriage, and her first husband were house parents at 88 Main Street during the summer of 1949. And Monroe and Isabel's elder son, Stephen, spent that summer as counselor at Camp Rabbit Hollow, building a planetarium, which he seemed to be famous for. I saw a picture of him in Life magazine with his planetarium. And their youngest son, Jonathan, went to Camp Pinnacle in Lyme, New Hampshire in 1949. And now I'm very happy, we are all very happy to introduce that same Jonathan Smith, now of Colorado, to see if he will correct anything.
Well, it's a delight to be here. Love being back in Northfield. Love to be here. It's so welcoming and it feels like home. I love this town. I thought of the benefits of growing up in Northfield, and there are many. So I have some stories I'd like to tell to kind of introduce my parents, what they were like from a son's perspective. The first story tells about my mother and father going on one of the initial visits to Germany to get an idea what hosteling was like. And my mother and father were cycling to this hostel, and my dad's pedal broke. And of course you can't pedal a bike with only one pedal. And so it was towards the evening, and my father said, "I will find a blacksmith, you go on to the hostel and I'll meet you there." Started raining and it was cold, and she went ahead and went into the town and asked where it was, and they in German said it was up on top of the hill, the mountain. And so she said, "And how do you get there?" And they said, "Well, there's a road that you can take maybe an hour and a half, or you can go up the stone stairs and it'll maybe only be 20 or so minutes." So she thought, well, I want to get out of this rain, I'll go up the stairs. And so she started up and continued up the stairs, and finally she was just exhausted. And she said, "I give up." And she sat down with a bike that she had been carrying up these stone stairs. And she thought, "I am so hungry." And she then remembered she had a piece of black pumpernickel bread in her knapsack. So she took it out and gnawed on it, ate it, and she said, "I feel invigorated. I'm rested, I've had food, what more could I want?" And so she continued up, and she found she was almost to the top of the mountain when she said she'd given up. And she saw the lights and the moon, and the clouds cleared. She saw the castle. And so she walked across the draw gate, and she recalled as she was walking across, there was some movement down, and as the stars and the moon shone, she saw a deer with its baby fawn down in the moat. She continued on, and the elderly couple that were handling the hospital said across the yard, and of course all this was in German, my mother had learned German, and they went into this little stone-walled room, and that was the hostel room. There was a little stove in the middle of the room. There was no wood, so she went out and gathered the wood and got the fire started, and eventually my dad came, and they had some soup or something and nestled down in the bedding that they had brought, because as a hosteler, you got your own food, you'd stop at places to get your own food usually. This is not the way it is today, but that's the way it started. and you would bring your own bedding, and you would always leave the place as clean or cleaner than when you found it. And so they had their own bedding, and Mom had gotten the wood from out in the forest, and they had the fire, and she said, as I laid down, I said, this is the most wonderful experience. I was exhausted, and I persevered. I was hungry, but I made it. I was cold and wet, but I got here. And she said, this is what every American youth needs. And that was the vision that she had, that she wanted every American youth to have this. She said, as we promoted it, I didn't tell them about the hunger and the wet and the cold, but how wonderful it was to meet other youth. But she said that was the thing that built the backbone of the people that went hosteling. It was tough, but it was wonderful. So that's the first story that kind of tells you about my mother and her spunk. The second story that I'd like to share is how my father saw things differently than most people saw. And my father loved horses. This story is about Lena Sunshine, a horse. Lena Sunshine was a racehorse and had a tremendous ability to win races. But she also had a very bad disposition. And she even had killed a man who came into her pen and displeased her somehow, I guess. And Lena Sunshine had killed a man, and so she was scheduled for euthanasia. So my dad heard about this, and he said, could I have the horse? I'll save her, I'll use her. And the owner said, yes, but under one condition. My dad said, what's that? He said, you never put a saddle on her. My dad said, all right, I'll do that. Now, the pictures that we have are much later than this, but at any rate, they're pictures of my dad and horses and his love of horses. But so Lena Sunshine, with this disposition, would run in the field, and at one time she ran into a barbed wire fence, and she got tangled up in it. And the more she was tangled, the more she fought. And she got her legs terribly cut, and her chest. And so my dad called in the vet and said to the vet, what should we do? And the vet said, well, with her disposition, put her down. And my dad said, if she was your wife, would you put her down? He said, well, no, of course not. He said, well, if she was your wife, what would you do? And he said, well, I would put her front legs in a big barrel of Epsom salts and splash it up onto her chest. And she might make it. So my dad said, thank you. And that's what he did. And Lena Sunshine let my dad get her feet into a barrel and get the Epsom salts 2 to 3 times a day. And eventually she started to heal. And eventually she fully healed. And my dad would have her out in the field, and as he went out into the field, she would run to him and then put her head in his chest and nuzzle him. And then my dad, after some period of time, said, you know, I think I'm getting along pretty well with her. So he took off his belt, buckled it around her neck, grabbed her mane, and swung up on her. And away they went, down the field and back and around, and just had a wonderful time together. And every time my dad would go in the field, she would run to him and just follow him around as he was fixing a fence or whatever he was doing. One day, the owner, the previous owner of Lena Sunshine, was visiting and said, Monroe, do you still have Lena Sunshine? He said, yes, I do. Would you like to see her? And he said, I would. And so they went out and they went into the field, and Lena was out in the field somewhere and she ran, and the owner thought, she's gonna kill me. So she jumped through the gate, and my dad stayed there, and she ran up and put her head in his chest. And then my dad took his belt, put it on her neck, and off they went around the field. And when he came back, the previous owner said, "No, that was amazing, absolutely amazing. But I'm a little disappointed." My dad said, "Well, why?" "Because I thought you were a man of your word." "Well, what did you feel I didn't keep my word about?" "You said you'd never ride her." My dad said, "No. I said I'd never put a saddle on her, and I never did." So that gives you a feeling of the way my dad could see others, not only people, but horses. He had a wonderful rapport with horses. Well, the third story I wanted to share was about my mother. As you understand, they did traveling, and this one time it was in New England. I think it was in New England, I don't really know, but they were traveling and the leaves were falling off the trees, and it was raining and the roads were slippery. And she was following in a car behind another car, and the other car passed a slow-moving truck on this narrow road. And so she gauged herself and shot past that truck. She had a bicycle rack or something in the back of the car, and passed the truck, and as she got beside the truck, she saw another vehicle coming in her lane. And so she, as quick as she could, pulled in, and she pulled in too quick, and the bike caught the old front bumpers that were one-piece bumpers with a hook kind of around, and it caught the truck, and it caused both of them to roll. And when they tried to find my mother, she had been ejected, and they couldn't find her. And finally they saw what they thought was a pile of bloody rags on a barbed wire fence. And as they examined it, they found it was my mother. Well, they rushed her to medical care and got her sewn up and saved her life. But as you know, tetanus is also something that can be on an old rusty barbed wire fence. They forgot to give her a tetanus shot, and she got lockjaw. And as she developed the symptoms, and they apparently had it, my father took her to the Battle Creek Sanitarium in Battle Creek, Michigan. No one had lived to that time. They took care of people, but no one had lived to that time with lockjaw at that place. So my dad got a picture of my brother. I wasn't born yet. A picture of my brother. Oh, I just gave away something. Okay, a picture of my brother and my sister, and put it there by her bed. And that gave her some initiative. The nurse fell for my mother. She thought my mother was something special. And so she devoted some time to trying to wiggle her toes, just to get her to wiggle her toe, because she was paralyzed, as well as going into the spasms which would hit. She was paralyzed. And 5 doctors had gotten together and told my dad she wouldn't live. So the nurse was working her toes, and one day, and I met the nurse years and years later, she said, she wiggled one toe. And the nurse broke down, because she knew my mom was going to live. And she did live. But she was also predicted that she would never be able to move much. And she did. And she was also told that she could definitely never walk. And she did. And then she was told that she wasn't strong enough to ever become pregnant, that pregnancy would kill her. about a year later, she and Dad decided they wanted another one. And she became pregnant, and that was me. I'm very grateful for that. So that was the third story. The fourth story, by then I was born and here in Northfield, and so this story is about me and my dad. My dad, as you've picked up, loved horses. And when he would be here, he would take me riding. Now this is before I was 10, because I moved at 10, so I was probably 5 or 6. He started me off young. And this time he had a horse named Rocket. Rocket, that was not a casual name. That was intended for that horse. And she lived up to her name, both in speed and in disposition. When you take a second, she was off. We also had a horse, Goldenrod. Goldenrod was not like Rocket. Goldenrod was a good plodder. And he saddled up Goldenrod and Rocket and said, let's go for a ride up to Garnet Rock. So if you go School Street, there's a little path, there was a little path, and I don't know now, which you could take off and you could go up to Garnet Rock. So we rode together, I on Goldenrod and Dad on Rocket. And I saw the way Rocket was acting, and I said, Dad, you gotta let me ride Rocket. You ride Goldenrod. No, you can't do that. Dad, and I badgered him all the way up to Garnet Rock. Let me ride Rocket, I can do it. And at Garnet Rock he said, you know, you think you can, but if she, and I've been keeping her under control, but if there was anything that got in her mind that she wanted to run, she'd be out of here. And no, you can't ride her. Well, I didn't stop. And so on the way back, I said, look, she's just walking. You gotta let me ride her. She's beautiful. He let me ride her. So on the way down, I just plodded along part way. And I don't know what got into me, but I thought I want to go just a little faster. So I just gently tapped her in the ribs. No, Goldenrod you'd had to thump to get to go, but not Rocket. That was all she took. She almost bowled my father and Goldenrod over as she passed them. Went down that trail, I was hanging on for dear life. The branches were battering my head and face, and she was at full speed down that trail, cutting the corners and leaning into them and turning. She got to School Street and took off School Street up to Main Street. And I'm thinking, what if there's a car there at the intersection? I was old enough to think things like that, but I couldn't control her. She was completely on her own. So we got to school in Maine. She cut down to Meadow and started to go down the hill. Was a little gate in the field, and it had a lot of bushes around it, but there was a narrow path and there was a gate, and she was going to barrel through that gate. And then all of a sudden she saw that the gate was closed. And she put all 4 legs straight, stiff, and slid to a stop. But I didn't. I went up over her head and landed on my chest. And I had breath knocked out of me. And I don't mean a little. And I could not suck in. I thought, I'm going to die. I can remember how terrified I was. I finally got a little bit in, And then I thought, I'm still gonna pass out. I was using all my strength of my chest to try to get some air in, and it had just been flattened out. Well, I did. By then, Dad and Goldenrod had got there, and he saw what had happened. But here's to illustrate my father. So I finally was breathing normally, and he said, well, let's go in, take the saddles off, and go to school. I said, Dad, I can't go to school today. I'm just not up to going to school today. And he said, are you breathing all right now? Yes. Did you break any bones or have any other injuries that would prevent you from going to school? No. Do you have a good reason why you shouldn't go to school? No. And that was my dad. He didn't take many excuses as acceptable. I thought of growing up in this town. It was safe. I saw a policeman last night and I asked him how long a police force had been here. And he said, well, the paid police force, 40 years. He didn't know how much longer before that. Well, 70 years ago, or 80 years ago, I didn't remember ever seeing a policeman. This was a safe town. It was a town of community. My brother, who was what we today would nickname a geek, he loved astronomy, and my dad had convinced him to ride the horse one night, one afternoon, and by nightfall he hadn't returned. My dad started concerning himself, started looking around where he thought he might be riding, and no Stephen was to be found. And he called on the community, and the community got together and started traversing the roads and such to see if they could see a horse loose or what had happened. And they found him lying on his back on the horse, gazing at the stars. But the community had pulled together. One time we had this large barn. It was thought to possibly be the largest in Franklin County. It was large. And at the top was this cupola, and my brother had made a little teeny planetarium in it, or a place where he could at least look out. And I had found my way up to it. And when I got there, I thought, this is so peaceful. I think I'll just close my eyes. And I did. And I slept there for quite a while. And my dad had no idea, and Mom, where I was. And they first called the staff out, and the staff was scouring the place. And then more of the community trying to find me. Finally, I woke up and I climbed down the ladder and I came out. Where were you? And I explained that I was up in the cupola. It relieved a lot of people that were looking for me. But my point was, the community pulled together. This was a wonderful place for a person to live. It was a delight. I'm so pleased that it made such an impact on my life growing up in Northfield. Thank you for letting me be with you. I have a number more stories, but I don't have more time. So Mary lined up at the Centennial Home that if afterwards you'd like me to share some more stories with you, she'll tell you, but I would love to share the stories because I love the experiences here. She'll let you know a little more. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much.
That was wonderful. Right now, we're going to hear from Danielle, who's here from International Hosteling USA, and she's going to, I think, give us a little idea of what it's like to be a hosteler right now. Danielle?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Danielle Brumfitt-Norris, and I'm with, we now call it Hi USA. It's a little easier to pronounce, and it's such an honor to be here. And I have to say, I'm a little bit starstruck to have met Jonathan, because I've heard so much about the Smiths, and really, I would not be doing the work that I get to do, which really is a privilege more than it is a job, if it weren't for Isabel and Monroe and them bringing this concept of hosteling to the U.S. So it's such a joy to be with you today. So as I say, we're now Hi USA, but we still carry all that Isabel and Monroe and before them Richard Sherman stood for. I'm sure many of you in this room understand the transformative power of travel. There's nothing like breaking bread with somebody from another culture. There's nothing like looking at things from different perspectives. And really, hosteling is a vessel for this. Hostels are built, they're purpose designed to bring people together, not just so folks can have accessible travel, but so they actually interact in the building, whether they're cooking together, whether they're hanging out in common rooms together, and that's what we're focused on to this day. Anytime we look to try and develop a new hostel, which is difficult and takes a lot of time, our priority is how will we bring people together? How will we provide a space that is welcoming for all? And so we're really proud of these vessels, these hostels. We do have hostels in the U.S., as you've heard today. We're not quite as big as when Isabel and Monroe first grew this movement. We have about 25 hostels across the U.S. right now. I will say, unfortunately, COVID had a pretty devastating effect on our organization, and we did have to close a number of hostels. We had to sell a couple buildings to just kind of keep going, but we're coming back. And as you heard earlier, in Massachusetts, we have 3 hostels, one just down the road in Boston, in Chinatown on Stewart Street, and then we have 3 seasonal hostels in the Cape and Islands, Martha's Vineyard, Hyannis, and Truro, and they've actually just opened up for the season. We continue to have the same mission. We're a nonprofit organization, and it's the same mission that we were founded on, which is to help all, especially the young, gain a greater understanding of the world and its people. So we're committed to not just the interaction, but we're also committed to our responsibility to the earth, which is something Richard Sherman, our German founder, was so passionate about. This is why he was out in nature. We believe in experiences, experiential education, and really connecting folks to why it's important to care about one another, but why it's important to care about our planet as well. And over the years, it was so, I didn't know about the camp that you shared about earlier that Isabel and Monroe had established. That was so exciting to hear, because that as well is in our DNA. We're really focused on broadening travel for all. Travel is not a luxury that everybody has exposure to. There are a lot of barriers to travel for many people. Some it's financial, some it's more kind of psychological, fear-based, and we're really focused on breaking down those barriers. So we're always looking to try and bring more people into hosteling. We have some programs that we've developed to do so. The first is called the Great Hostel Give Back. So this is a program that we do every winter. It takes place in January and February. And during that time, we offer groups of 4 or more the opportunity to stay in our hostels for free in exchange for local community service. So they come into communities where we have hostels. They volunteer not with us, but with different community organizations, because we are very active community partners. And in exchange, they can stay in the hostels for free. And the great thing is, not only are we benefiting the community, but we're also allowing people who may not have thought of staying in a hostel, but may want to travel. They then base themselves in the hostel and realize what's so unique and special with that. We also have scholarship programs that we run. The first is called Explore America, and this is a scholarship that we give to young people, 18 to 30, and they receive a stipend for travel along with support, professional support in how to travel, how to book your trip, how to pack for a trip, and then they stay at our hostels across the U.S. And then our other scholarship program is very similar to the TRIPS program. And when you had mentioned that it was such an important program, to this day we have stakeholders really active in our organization because of the TRIPS program, because they experienced what it was like to travel abroad. So our Explore the World scholarship is a little different. We don't actually go with them, but we do train the recipients on how to travel. They receive a stipend, and then they do a trip abroad, and they have to have a hostel experience during that trip. So those are just some of the programs that we're really trying to develop to really bring more people into hosteling, but to show everyone that travel can be accessible, and we will continue to work to make that a possibility. The other thing I'll just mention is you've heard AYH and you've heard Hosteling International. So AYH, American Youth Hostels, that's how we were founded. We still, as a business name, are AYH, but we actually changed our name. We do business now as Hi USA, Hosteling International USA, and the reason for that is hosteling is for everyone. So this is my official invitation to all of you. We do have hostels around the U.S. You don't have to do chores. You don't have to leave at 6 in the morning. And we do have private rooms. So we have dorm spaces, we have private spaces, we have rooms with bathrooms in the rooms. And this is also to reflect that people travel differently. People travel differently when they're younger, when they're older, when their circumstances change with their family. And we'd love to see all of you in our hostels, both here in the U.S. or in the 3,000 plus hostels that are found in 62 countries around the world. So thank you so much. Thank you for this celebration. Thank you for the stories that have been shared. And please come and join us in our hostels and become hostlers along with us. Thank you.
Time for a little more music.
So I'm just curious how many people have stayed in youth hostels here today. So look around and you can talk to anybody with their arm raised, because if you've done it, I can guarantee people have stories to tell.
We just spent a week in the most amazing hostel. I'm not sure it's part of the International Federation, but it was in Kyoto. It was a very, very old building. We just spent a month in Japan, and probably the highlight place where we stayed in the trip was a whole week in a hostel, an international hostel with students from all around the world, and also people who were older like us, in a very old section of Kyoto, in a very old traditional building. And it was just wonderful, the interactions in the kitchen where people were fixing food and helping each other figure out what to do. So the spirit is definitely alive in many, many different forms today.
It was so much fun. You know, being in Japan is such a different culture, and not as many people as you might think speak English there. So Peter got to try out a little bit of his Japanese, which he had been studying. And I got to listen. But in the hostel, you know, there were people from all over the world coming, and what was so cool was there was someone there from Spain, so I got to speak Spanish, which I speak a little bit, and I can't even tell you, you know, just our experiences with the hostels here in the United States and abroad. Everyone's been so kind.
While she's tuning, I'll say that when I was probably about 1970, I was hitchhiking to the hostel in Paris. And what do you know, in the middle of all these, probably in a very large hostel, one of my closest friends in high school just showed up. That's the kind of thing that happens in
It happens.
Miracle.
It's so weird. So this song is not in the AYH songbook that we got the privilege of sort of looking at some of the songs. This is one that we often sing when we're leading singing. So after the program, you can take a look at some of our stuff. Peter and I, obviously, we've edited a couple songbooks, and we work closely with with Pete Seeger and others to kind of carry on the tradition of community building through music. So let's try this one. It's by Woody Guthrie. So anybody?
It's an easy chorus.
Peter and I have a website called Rise Up and Sing, and we both are involved in lots of projects. I sing with a trio called Dear Ella, and I also sing in a Joni Mitchell tribute band called Big Yellow Taxi. And so I'll be heading out straight away from here to go do a concert with them, but Peter will stick around after. Well, this has an echo, so I sing, you gotta walk, you go, you gotta walk that lonesome valley, that lonesome valley. You gotta walk it by yourself. Nobody here can walk it for you. You gotta walk that lonesome valley by yourself. Well, you gotta walk that lonesome valley. You gotta walk by yourself. Nobody here can walk it for you. Gotta walk that lonesome valley by yourself. Now there's a road that leads to glory through the valley far away. Nobody else can walk it for you. They can only point the way. You gotta walk that lonesome valley. You gotta walk it by yourself. Nobody here can walk it for you. You gotta walk that lonesome valley by yourself. Now though the road be rough and muddy, and the hills be steep and high, we can sing as we go marching. Here's what he got in that one big Union by and by. You gotta walk that lonesome valley. You gotta walk it by yourself. Nobody here can walk it for you. You gotta walk that lonesome valley by yourself. Well, obviously you don't have to walk the valley by yourself. I mean, you don't have to. But I love the idea that it's encouraging us to think for ourselves, and I think that's what Woody Guthrie was all about. So we got maybe 2 more songs here. I'm not sure what we're doing on time. Time for maybe one more? One more.
4:30. It's up to you.
Two more. Okay. So many songs, so little time. I mean, we make songbooks that have 2,400 songs in them. So. What you got there, Peter?
You go through you want to do. You can do one then.
Okay, let's do that one.
Which one? Which one? You did that. You did tell me. This is one that is in the Hostel songbook, I think. It's a kind of an old chestnut, which some of you may know for that reason. We seem to be mostly over a certain age in this audience.
No. That's all right.
We're all young apart.
We all have younger people in our lives, for sure. And I like to think that both our boys are completely different. Our oldest is 38. Our youngest is almost 30, about to get married. Completely different on the spectrum. The younger one loves to go out foraging in the woods, like Yule Gibbons. And the older one loves to to pull out his guitar and play with his kiddo, and they go traveling all the time. So we're passing on a lot of good things, I think. So the Ash Grove, it's a really pretty song.
Old song.
Yeah, it's very old, and you know, it was sort of interesting to look at the list and see this would have been one of the songs that got sung around if that wonderful songbook had been passed around the campfire. The ash grove, how graceful, how plainly 'tis speaking, the heart through it played has language for me. Whenever the light through its branches is breaking, a host of kind faces is gazing on me. The friends of my childhood again are before me. Each step wakes a memory as freely I roam. With soft whispers laden, leaves rustle o'er me. The ash grove, home is my home. My laughter is over, my step loses lightness. Old countryside measures soft on my ear. I only remember the past and its brightness. The dear ones I mourn for again gather here. From out of the shadows, the loving looks greet me, and wistfully searching the leafy green lawn, I find other faces fond bending to greet me. The ash grove, a home is my I love the sentiment of that song. I don't think these songs ever get too old, honestly. I grew up in a family that went camping. We didn't have a lot of money. We went camping a lot, and my mom even wrote a book about it called Your Family Goes Camping. Talked about what to do with babies and how to deal with diapers. Back then it was just cloth diapers, obviously. I'm that old. We sat and sang around campfires. And Peter and I, even though we grew up in different places, our parents had the same songbooks in their cabinets. What was one of them? Songfest.
Fireside Book of Folk Songs.
Fireside Book of Folk Songs.
So I'm singing.
We're going to do one more song.
And you know, this song, I thought about this because of when we were hearing at the very beginning, when the founder of the youth hostels in Germany was taking young people into the mountains to hike in the woods. And this is a song which is part of American folk culture today, coming from a musical of Rodgers and Hammerstein. So we'd like to do Edelweiss sound of music.
And please sing with us on this one. And thank you again for inviting us. Thanks to Mary and everyone who organized today. By the way, we live right over in Amherst, so if you want to have some singing, just let us know.
We've performed at the ice cream store in the past.
Oh, yes. Edelweiss, Edelweiss, every morning you greet me, small and white, clean and bright, you look happy to meet me. Blossoms of snow
Hostel alive for another 100 years.
Yes, thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Misha Storm, just so you have another face to look at. So I just want to thank everybody for coming and for joining us at Song of Memories. And thank you again to Annie and Peter for their music, Joel and Danielle for sharing their knowledge, and Jonathan for sharing his memories. And a big thank you to Bob Emberly and the Community Bible Church for having us here today and for many other events during the 350th. Everyone is invited across the street and down a little bit to the Centennial House for light refreshments and for hearing more from Jonathan if everybody wants to do that. So join us over there. Thank you.